In the quiet hallways of a Portland, Oregon middle school, where the chatter of children blends with the echo of bells and the faint scent of chalk dust lingers, a silent injustice festers. 11-year-old Tyler Reed walks these corridors every day, his small shoulders hunched, his stomach empty, not from neglect, but from a cruelty disguised as authority. For months, his lunch vanishes, taken by a man meant to guide him, a teacher whose mocking words cut deeper than hunger ever could. Behind closed doors, Tyler hides his tears, too afraid to speak, until a father's quiet intuition cracks the silence wide open. 11-year-old Tyler Reed trudged along the cracked sidewalks of his Portland neighborhood, his stomach gnawing with hunger. The chill of the late afternoon wrapped around him as he made his way from school toward home. Every step resonated with a quiet despair that no child should ever feel. Tyler's eyes, large and wary, darted from shadow to shadow, burdened by a secret he too young to fully comprehend. At school that day, something had been terribly wrong. His lunchbox had come home empty, another day of silent starvation. Inside the old, echoing halls of his middle school, the atmosphere buzzed with the familiar hum of ringing school bells and the sharp, nostalgic scent of chalk mingled with dusty textbooks. The air in his classroom had been tense that morning too. As the final bell rang, the low murmur of hurried students filled the corridors, and Tyler could still hear the whispered jeers and stifled laughter directed at him. His math teacher, Mr. Paul Harris, a man with an air of superiority and a voice that dripped with disdain, had made a spectacle of him. In front of his classmates, with a sneer and a mocking tone, Mr. Harris had shouted, "Come on, boy, get your sandwich. Or are you just here to look like you belong?" His words had cut deeply, and the cruel laughter that followed had made Tyler shrink into himself. The memory of that moment painted Tyler's world in shades of shame and isolation. Every time he returned home, his empty lunchbox told a silent story of neglect. Unseen by his peers, tears of frustration often welled up in his eyes, but he learned to hide them behind a mask of quiet resignation. That hidden sorrow had not gone unnoticed. Later that day, when Tyler finally arrived at home on a gray, drizzly evening, his father, Matt Reed, a hard-working engineer with gentle eyes that belied great inner strength, immediately sensed that something was amiss. In the modest, worn-down kitchen, the aroma of reheated stew barely masked the tension. Matt noticed the empty lunchbox sitting on the table, a stark, painful reminder that today, once again, Tyler had come home hungry. The silence between them was thick with unspoken worries. "Tyler," Matt asked softly, his brow furrowing with concern, "what happened today? Where's your lunch?" His gentle inquiry prompted Tyler to lower his eyes in shame, his small voice barely audible as he confessed, "Mr. Harris took it. He said he needed to inspect it, but he laughed and called me a sandwich boy." The words dropped like stones into the quiet room. Matt's heart pounded with anger and sorrow as he realized the injustice his son had suffered. His mind raced, recalling similar complaints that had been murmured among parents and overheard by concerned students. Determined to expose this abuse of power, Matt silently formulated a plan. An engineer by trade, he had both the technical know-how and, more importantly, the resolve to uncover the truth. That evening, after tucking Tyler into bed and comforting him with quiet reassurances that he would fix what was wrong, Matt set to work. Sitting at his small, cluttered desk by a dim lamp, he pulled out a fresh piece of paper and a pen. With steady hands, he wrote a terse yet powerful note addressed simply to Mr. Harris. The note was concise. "Mr. Harris, I know that you have been taking my son's lunch. On the attached flash drive is video evidence from the classroom cameras documenting your actions. Meet me today at 1800 hours outside the school." Every word dripped with a determination forged from years of silently enduring injustice. Alongside the note, Matt retrieved a small, unassuming flash drive, one on which he had already carefully compiled the video footage he had discreetly accessed through his engineering connections to the school's surveillance system. The footage, grainy but vivid, captured Mr. Harris's disturbing behavior, laughing, jeering, and brazenly confiscating Tyler's food under the guise of inspection. As the clock ticked toward the end of the day, Matt's resolve solidified. He carefully placed both the note and the flash drive inside Tyler's rucksack, ensuring that they lay hidden among his everyday belongings. The weight of these items seemed to symbolize the heavy burden of truth that would soon ripple through the halls of the school, a burden that could no longer be ignored. In that tense, breathless moment, as Matt double-checked the contents of the bag, the overwhelming determination in his eyes was unmistakable. Outside, the fading light of dusk cloaked the school in a dim, somber glow, as if the day itself had grown weary of the injustice it bore witness to. Inside, the quiet hum of routine would soon be shattered by the stark confrontation that Matt's evidence would provoke. For now, the note and flash drive rested silently in Tyler's backpack, a promise of retribution and a turning point that would challenge the toxic habits of those in power. The following morning, the echoes of yesterday's injustice lingered like a heavy fog over the halls of the school. In the early light, as the corridors of Portland Middle School began to stir with the low hum of chatter and the clatter of locker doors, Matt Reed discreetly observed the usual bustle with a determined heaviness in his heart. At home that evening, after ensuring Tyler was settled into bed, Matt had painstakingly placed the note and the flash drive into Tyler's backpack, small tokens that could reveal the truth behind Mr. Paul Harris's relentless abuse. Now, the day had come when those seeds of evidence would disrupt the status quo. In one of his early classes, Mr. Harris strolled into his classroom with an air of habitual arrogance, completely unaware that fate was about to catch up with him. The classroom was filled with the familiar symphony of ringing bells, the scrape of chairs, and the faint, lingering aroma of chalk dust. As he prepared to begin his lesson, his eyes inadvertently fell upon Tyler's backpack, still sitting idly on a bench by the doorway. Something about its weight or the way it lay there, unclaimed by its owner, caught his attention. Curiosity, tinged with an undercurrent of suspicion, compelled Mr. Harris to pick up the backpack. His experienced hands, steady and confident in other matters, now hesitated as he unfurled a folded piece of paper from a hidden pocket. The note, bold and uncompromising in its message, read, "Mr. Harris, I know you have been taking my son's lunch. On the attached flash drive, you'll find video evidence from our classroom cameras detailing your actions. Meet me today at 1800 hours outside the school." For a long, dreadful moment, Mr. Harris stared at the note as if it were a mirror reflecting his own darker truths. His face drained of color. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he slowly removed the flash drive and examined it, its small, unassuming exterior belying the explosive power of its content. Anger twisted into a deep, gnawing fear. The directive was clear, and the evidence, if reviewed by someone else, could shatter his carefully maintained reputation. In the quiet that followed, Mr. Harris's mind raced. He imagined the flash drive's contents. Grainy footage of him mockingly confiscating a young boy's lunch, the echo of a cruel laugh, amplified in the sterile surroundings of a classroom. The vivid images played relentlessly in his mind, and his bravado began to crumble. What if this evidence reached the director or even the local media? Each thought struck him like a blow, each scenario sketching the outline of a downfall he had never anticipated. Trying to regain control, he attempted to compose himself, telling himself that it must be some sort of setup or misunderstanding. But deep down, every instinct screamed that his actions had been recorded and would not be swept under the rug this time. His heart pounded erratically, an involuntary drumbeat of fear and impending consequence. He clutched the note so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his eyes flicking across the document again as if searching for an escape. Outside, as students and teachers began to fill the hallways and the faint sounds of morning announcements drifted from a distant Pennsylvania system, Mr. Harris retreated to an empty classroom. There, in the solitude of cold, unyielding walls, he finally allowed the gravity of his predicament to settle in. Sitting at a small desk beneath a single window through which a pale autumn light filtered in, he replayed the harsh words of the note in his mind. The whisper of the recorder's contents, now a phantom echo of his previous cruelty, haunted him as he weighed his options. Was this the moment when everything would come crashing down? The thought of facing not only his superiors but also the wrath of concerned parents and the media tightened the grip of panic around his chest. In that silent, empty room, Mr. Harris realized that the truth, once concealed behind sarcasm and condescension, had finally caught up with him. His carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack under the pressure of undeniable evidence. As he sat there, lost in a maelstrom of regret and fear, the sound of distant footsteps in the corridor seemed to mock him, a reminder that time was not on his side. The note and the flash drive lay on the desk, stark and unyielding witnesses to his misdeeds. With every heartbeat, the realization grew. If left unchecked, this secret might soon ignite a scandal that could ruin him. In that stark moment of quiet terror, Mr. Harris closed his eyes briefly, a single tear glistening on his cheek, as he listened to his own ragged breathing, a desperate prelude to the inevitable storm that was about to break. After the disquieting discovery in the empty classroom, Mr. Paul Harris knew he could no longer remain hidden behind closed doors. With a turbulent mix of fear, shame, and anger coursing through him, he decided to confront the matter directly. Slipping out of the vacant classroom, he hurried along the quiet corridor toward the main entrance of the school, his steps quickening despite the weight on his mind. Outside, under a slate-gray Oregon sky, the early morning chatter of arriving students filled the air, but Harris barely registered the sounds as his thoughts collided inside him. In the school parking lot, near the entrance where Matt Reed often waited for his son, a tense scene unfolded. Matt, still reeling from the revelation of the note and flash drive, had been anxiously awaiting the arrival of Mr. Harris. As if drawn by the gravity of the circumstances, Mr. Harris emerged from the side door, his face ashen and eyes darting with palpable anxiety. Their eyes met in a brief, fraught standoff. "Matt," Mr. Harris began, his voice trembling more than usual. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this—" He paused and looked away, as if the very idea of being confronted by evidence was too immense to handle aloud. Matt stepped forward, his face set in a determined scowl. "What I'm doing, Mr. Harris," he said in a voice firm with resolve, "is holding you accountable for what you've done. My son Tyler comes home hungry, and now I see the truth in that digital recorder you've tried to hide. The empty lunchbox speaks for itself." His words struck a chord in the stillness of the lot. "You have been taking his lunch under the guise of inspection, and mocking him, calling him names. This isn't acceptable." Mr. Harris's eyes flickered with a mix of indignation and terror as he replied, "That's absurd, Matt. You have to understand it was just a check. I never meant any harm. I was just trying to maintain order." His tone was a blend of defensive pragmatism and a hint of desperation. Internally, he struggled to deny the mounting evidence. Every replay of the footage echoed in his mind, each sneer and harsh laugh a reminder of his misconduct. Matt's gaze narrowed as he took a step closer, lowering his tone so only they could hear over the distant buzz of arriving vehicles. "Order? Don't patronize me. You don't see the empty lunchbox, the tears in Tyler's eyes. You never considered that your checks might be nothing more than bullying. I have undeniable proof. The note, the flash drive with video recordings, every single detail meticulously documented." His gloved hand gripped a crumpled copy of the note he had pressed into Tyler's backpack. Harris's lips trembled into a forced smile. "You are making a scene, Matt. I'm not here to be ambushed in the parking lot." His words, feeble and defensive, faltered in the face of Matt's unwavering stare. The air between them grew heavy with tension as students continued to stream into the campus, oblivious to the unfolding conflict. "Ambushed," Matt retorted sharply. "This isn't an ambush. It's a confrontation with the truth. What you've done to my son won't stand, and I refuse to let you keep hurting him. I demand an explanation, and if you can't give me that, then I'll take this all the way." His voice, though low, carried the authority of a man who cared deeply for his child and was prepared to fight for justice. Mr. Harris ran a hand through his thinning hair, his eyes darting nervously as he scanned the lot, perhaps wishing desperately for a quiet escape. "Listen," he began again, voice faltering. I already told you. This is a misunderstanding. There's no need to escalate things further. But his plea hung in the air, brittle and unconvincing. Matt inhaled deeply, his heart pounding with resolve and paternal fury. I'm not going to let you off the hook this time, Mr. Harris. I'm taking this matter to the principal. Today, I'm going to the office of Mrs. Ellen Clark, the director, and you will have to face the consequences of your actions. His tone was not just a promise. It was a command, a final boundary drawn in the dust of the parking lot. For a brief moment, Mr. Harris's eyes widened in a mix of anger and deep-rooted fear. The last vestiges of his arrogant composure faltered. He realized that the undeniable evidence and Matt's determination had cornered him. He hesitated, looking down as if summoning the courage to speak, but his words died in his throat. Unsure and visibly shaken, he muttered, I don't want this to go any further." His voice trailed off, betraying his inner torment. At that critical juncture, the sound of muffled footsteps from inside the school broke through the tension. The approach of Mrs. Ellen Clark, the school director, who had been alerted by concerned staff about disturbances in the parking area. In that moment, the fate of Mr. Harris, and the hope for justice in the eyes of a determined father, hung precariously in the balance. Matt turned to Harris one final time, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and cold resolve. "Then let's go inside, Mr. Harris," he said, gesturing toward the building. "Let's let the truth be heard in the place where it belongs. I'll see you there, and maybe then you'll finally confront what you've done." With that, Matt strode purposefully toward the school's entrance, his silhouette merging with the pale light of the early morning, leaving Mr. Harris standing alone in the shadow of impending accountability. Later that afternoon, following the disquieting confrontation in the school parking lot, Matt Reed led his son into a quiet office down the hall. A small, cluttered space adorned with family photos and faded certificates that belonged to Principal Ellen Clark. The air was thick with apprehension and the lingering whoosh of whispered rumors. Matt's heart pounded steadily as he closed the door behind them, sealing off the corridor sounds. Across from him, seated behind a time-worn desk, Mrs. Ellen Clark looked up from a stack of papers. Her kind yet serious eyes were overshadowed by concern. She had heard murmurs of unrest this morning, and now something in Matt's solemn demeanor told her that something was gravely amiss. Without wasting a second, Matt reached into his bag and withdrew the flash drive and the neatly folded note, the very evidence he had painstakingly gathered over the past day. "Mrs. Clark," he began, his voice measured and low, "I need you to see this." Sliding onto the chair opposite her, he connected the flash drive to her aging computer. The screen immediately flickered with the grainy footage from the classroom's security camera. Matt's voice was steady as he explained each detail while pointing at the screen. There was unmistakable video evidence of Mr. Paul Harris, the math teacher, sneering and laughing as he whisked away Tyler's lunch, all under the guise of inspection. The recorded audio cut through the stillness with every cruel remark, a string of dismissive jokes that reduced Tyler to nothing more than that sandwich boy. Mrs. Clark's face shifted from initial curiosity to shock. She rubbed her temples and, for a moment, struggled to find her voice. The evidence was irrefutable. The motions, the tone, the look on Mr. Harris's face echoed a culture of abuse hidden in plain sight. This is completely unacceptable," she murmured, her voice both firm and tinged with sorrow. "This behavior undermines the trust not only of parents and students, but the very integrity of our school." Matt leaned forward, his eyes burning with quiet determination. "I have seen it happen day after day, Mrs. Clark," he said, his voice wavering just briefly with emotion. "My son Tyler comes home hungry and hurt, and I cannot let this injustice continue. I have also kept detailed notes and have even copies of records from other parents who have faced similar neglect. I'm here to demand accountability." Mrs. Clark took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts as she stared at the flashing images on the screen. After a long, measured silence, broken only by the distant hum of the school building, she spoke, her tone resolute and authoritative. "Mr. Reed, I cannot condone this abuse of power in our school. she said firmly, her gaze unwavering. It is my duty to ensure that every member of our community is treated with the dignity they deserve. Therefore, I am issuing an ultimatum. Mr. Harris must immediately offer a public apology to Tyler and the entire student body, and he must be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Should he refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to report this matter to the district office, and, if necessary, to local law enforcement. Her words resonated with finality, echoing in the quiet office. On hearing these words, the tension in the room escalated to a palpable level. At that moment, an uneasy silence filled the space as if the very walls were bracing themselves for the fallout. Across the hall, the quiet murmur of the school's routine now seemed distant in light of this storm brewing within the administrative chamber. Outside the office, somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors, Mr. Paul Harris had caught wind of the developing confrontation. His face, already etched with worry earlier, betrayed equal parts fear and defiance as he wrestled with the ultimatum. With his pride wounded and aware that the evidence was damning, a decision had to be made. Over the next few minutes, in a secluded hallway lit by a harsh fluorescent tube, Harris could be heard muttering to himself, I can't let this go public. I must think of my career," he pleaded under his breath, his voice cracking as he weighed the cost of an apology against the collapse of his professional reputation. The scene in the principal's office reached its climax when Mrs. Clark fixed her piercing gaze on the assembled evidence and then on the phone in her hand. "I will make a call now," she announced gravely, "so that Mr. Harris is aware of what awaits him." The sound of dialing echoed, and the tension spiked even higher as the principal prepared to alert the higher authorities. At that moment, with the ultimatum hanging in the air and the sound of an imminent phone call reverberating in the quiet office, the fate of Mr. Harris teetered on the brink of an irreversible decision. The following Monday, the school auditorium was transformed into an impromptu assembly hall, charged with an almost unbearable hush. Long rows of wooden pews and folding chairs faced a makeshift stage, where the weight of the past few days hung heavy in the dim morning light filtering through stained glass windows. Parents, teachers, and students, anxious and expectant, shuffled in quietly, eyes filled with worry and anticipation. The atmosphere was a palpably somber blend of regret and determination, punctuated by the occasional soft creak of wood and the murmur of whispered conversations. At the front of the stage, Mrs. Ellen Clark stepped up to the podium, her face set with a firm resolve. Today's assembly was not merely a routine meeting, but a public reckoning meant to restore dignity and justice to a community shaken by the revelations. In her measured, even tone, she began, "Today, we must address issues that have deeply affected our school community. We have heard serious allegations and witnessed undeniable evidence of misconduct." Her voice reverberated off the walls, commanding the attention of every ear in the room. After her opening remarks, she turned the attention of everyone to one man, Mr. Paul Harris, who had been placed on administrative leave pending this inquiry. With hesitance and a trembling dignity, Harris slowly entered the auditorium from backstage. His once confident stride now faltered as he stepped into the glaring spotlight. Every eye in the building was fixed on him. The students' faces flickered with a mix of sympathy, curiosity, and even a cold sort of judgment. Teachers looked on, their expressions a blend of disappointment and relief that accountability was finally being served. Harris reached the podium, and for a painfully long moment the auditorium was silent, save for the soft rustle of papers and the distant beep of a microphone being adjusted. His voice, quivering and low, finally emerged. I would like to apologize." The words came haltingly at first, as though the weight of shame had choked him. He paused, swallowing hard, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry for my actions," he continued, his tone wavering, "for taking away your lunch, for the name-calling, and for all the disrespect I have shown. I realize now that my behavior was unacceptable, and I regret hurting not only my students but also the entire school community." A hushed ripple of mixed reactions ran through the assembly. Some students exchanged relieved whispers, while a few in the back looked on with sympathy albeit tinged with skepticism. A couple of teachers nodded slowly, acknowledging the necessity of accountability. Even the principal, Mrs. Clark, maintained a stern yet compassionate expression as she observed the unfolding apology. Yet, the atmosphere was still weighted with an undercurrent of tension and disbelief. Every word from Harris was met with an echo of incredulity, a silent repudiation from those who had long been anxious about his unchecked cruelty. After his apology, the tension escalated as Mrs. Clark delivered the principal's ultimatum, reiterating the stakes. If this behavior is to persist, there will be no choice but to involve law enforcement, and such matters cannot remain within the boundaries of our school, she declared firmly. Therefore, Mr. Harris, consider your employment terminated with immediate effect. Today, we stand for accountability and respect. A shudder of murmurs and sympathetic expressions passed through the auditorium. In the midst of it all, Tyler sat quietly in the front row, his eyes cast downward but shining with a mixture of relief and lingering sadness. His peers, some openly crying, some talking in hushed voices, expressed implicitly that they had been waiting for change for far too long. As Mrs. Clark concluded the assembly, the murmur among the students and teachers over the corridors grew louder. In hushed but animated whispers, groups of students discussed what they had just witnessed. "Did you hear him?" one whispered. "And he's really gone," another replied in a tremulous tone. The moment was not simply about the firing of a teacher. It was about the reclamation of dignity in their everyday lives. The assembly had become a turning point, a public insistence that no one should be allowed to demean or mistreat a child, not even under the pretext of order. In that charged atmosphere, the collective voice of the school demanded a fresh start and a commitment to change. When the assembly finally ended, the corridors echoed not just with footsteps but with a feeling of transformation. Mr. Harris was escorted out with markedly subdued looks from his peers and with a heavy sense of defeat, leaving behind an assembly that had been united in its hope for a better, kinder future. Even as he passed through the front doors, a group of students in whispered conversation expressed a cautious optimism that the school, now awakened to the consequences of its past, would genuinely change. In that pivotal moment, with his resignation echoing as a verdict of justice, the promise of a new beginning took hold of the school, and deep within Tyler's heart, the spark of renewed confidence began to glow. In the weeks that followed the monumental school assembly, an unmistakable change began to ripple through Portland Middle School. The once tense corridors now hummed with a cautious hope, as teachers and students alike found themselves united by the painful lesson of accountability. New anti-bullying policies were introduced and a series of workshops on respect and empathy were scheduled, promising to transform the toxic environment that had allowed Mr. Harris's behavior to go unchecked. The incident stirred not only internal reforms but also ignited a broader dialogue in the community about the rights of every child to be treated with dignity. For Tyler Reed, the once frightened 11-year-old who had spoken out with trembling conviction, the aftermath was life-changing. In the days following the assembly, he received an outpouring of support from classmates and even from teachers who had witnessed the fallout. His quiet bravery became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the softest voice might break the silence of injustice. Tyler began to open up in class, sharing his thoughts and ideas with a newfound confidence. His teachers, now more sensitized to the impacts of their words and actions, carefully nurtured his potential, and his friends rallied around him, offering encouragement and solidarity. Outside the walls of the school, the consequences for Mr. Paul Harris were swift and severe. Unable to salvage his reputation within the academic community, and now facing the stinging public critique that his actions had engendered, he found himself blacklisted by every respectable school district in the area. Ultimately, Mr. Harris was forced to leave the world of education. Within a month, an offer came from a small auto parts store located in a quiet town several hours away, a place far removed from the vibrant, youthful energy of a school. His new role, though far less prestigious, served as a grim reminder of the cost of unchecked cruelty. In that modest store, amidst the scent of grease and cold metal, Mr. Harris's days were now filled with the hum of machinery and the quiet monotony of administrative tasks, a far cry from the lively chatter and learning of classrooms. As the story of the incident spread through local media, the town of Portland found itself embroiled in discussions about justice, power, and the protection of children's rights. Community meetings and town halls buzzed with debates on how to create safer schools and ensure that every complaint was taken seriously. The scandal was immortalized in headlines: bravery beyond words, young Tyler sparks change, and a lesson in accountability. School overhauls policies after shocking incident. These discussions not only brought the issue of bullying and harassment into the public spotlight, but also inspired many to re-examine their own behaviors in professional and personal environments. In an interview with a local newspaper, Matt Reed, Tyler's father, reflected on the tumultuous events with a mix of bittersweet relief and unyielding resolve. "I always knew my son's voice mattered," he said quietly, his eyes misted with emotions. "It took immense courage for him to speak out. And now, our community is learning that silence in the face of injustice can no longer be tolerated." His words resonated deeply, evoking a collective acknowledgement that change, though often born from pain, was both necessary and transformative. At the same time, the administration of Portland Middle School embraced the need for new beginnings. Under the guidance of Director Ellen Clark, the school implemented a comprehensive review of its policies and practices. Restorative justice programs were introduced, and a dedicated task force was established to ensure that every student's well-being was safeguarded. Teachers, many of whom had grown indifferent in the comfort of routine, now engaged in reflective practices. They began to approach their roles not merely as educators but as guardians of a nurturing environment, a commitment to preventing any form of mistreatment from tarnishing the promise of education. In the quiet moments of reflection that followed these sweeping changes, the halls of the school seemed to whisper a promise: that every voice, no matter how small, could ignite a revolution if given the chance to be heard. The transformation of the school, coupled with the personal victories of the Reed family, served as a beacon of hope, not just for those affected by the scandal, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless against injustice. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.